at how to cut out a pattern. A pattern is a piece of paper that has the shape and measurements for the garment that you are going to be making. This is specifically in relation to your shiki kimono project. What I have here is the front piece of the pattern. As you can see, it sits and it's designed to go along the front of the body, and it has this slope that goes down to the middle, to the center front. Here we have our front pattern piece for our kimono. As you can see, the pattern has instructions on it, and it lets you know what kind of pattern it is, what size it is, and how many you need to cut. So as we can see, this is a quick sew pattern for a kimono. It's the front, you need to cut 2, and it has a 1.5 center seam allowance. You can also see that it is marked with the front edge and with the side seam. So you know what sides you need to join to your back and what will be left open at the front. As you can see, these are our notches cut out. It doesn't matter if they're not completely accurate, it just matters that they're not too big so that you're not cutting into your seam allowance too much. A few things to note with working with patterns. They often have markings on them, and I'm going to explain to you about what those markings mean. If I hold the pattern up this way, you can see that there is a red line along the pattern. This is what's known as the grain line. The grain line allows a person to cut the pattern out along the correct way on their fabric. So the grain line means that you need to cut your pattern out with this line here parallel to the selvage of your fabric, and we'll talk about the selvage in a moment. A couple of other things that there will be on the pattern. It will have the name of the pattern, it will have what the pattern is, it will tell you whether it's the front or the back, it will tell you how many you need to cut out. It will also tell you if you need to cut it on the fold or if you need to cut 2 separate pieces. This pattern here also includes the seam allowance that you need to use. On this pattern, the seam allowance is included. On patterns, you will also find 2 or sometimes singular little triangles. These are called notches. Notches need to be cut out of both the pattern and the fabric, and they allow you to make sure that when you're joining your seams together, your fabric is lined up in the correct position and you are lining up the correct sides of your fabric. That's a pattern piece. Let's talk about the selvage of the fabric. When you are working with fabric, it comes on a roll. When you go to Spotlight and you buy it, you'll find it on a roll. On either end of that roll of fabric, there is 2 finished lines. That's called the selvage. On this piece of fabric, you can see that the selvage doesn't fray and it hasn't been cut. It has little dots along the lines as well, and it's a finished edge. It's really important when you're cutting out your patterns and cutting out your fabric that your fabric is laid out correctly. The correct way to fold your fabric ready to be cut out is to fold it selvage to selvage, which means that you get both ends of the fabric. One has the selvage and this one has the selvage, and put them together and then fold your fabric in half. Your fabric needs to be long and skinny. Generally, it's hard to see the whole length, but the fabric is long and skinny. And that's when you know that your fabric is folded correctly. It's really important to lay your fabric out flat over a large surface so that you have a perfect working area. As you can see here, I've laid my fabric out nice and flat. There's nothing around me. I don't have anything underneath my fabric or anything that can get in the way. This is how your fabric needs to be when you're cutting out your pattern. When we're cutting out patterns, we want to minimize our fabric wastage. So we want to make sure that we're using as much of the fabric as possible and leaving enough for spare if we need it. We don't want to put our patterns all over the place randomly so that we're wasting a lot of fabric. Some things that you're going to need in preparation to cut out your fabric are pins, tailor's chalk, and a tape measure. We're going to use these things to make cutting out our pattern a little bit easier and to make sure that we cut it out as accurately as possible. The first thing we're going to do when laying your pattern out on your fabric is to place your pattern as close to the edges as possible with your grey line, the red line on the pattern, running parallel to the selvage. Make sure it's nice and flat and that you don't have any bumps in the pattern. Next thing is we're going to use our tape. We're going to use our tape measure to measure the parallel line from our grey line to our selvage. We need to make sure that this line is the same width the whole way down. Going to use my tape measure and just measure along. Going to measure in about 3 places. Just down this end, it's a little bit wider, so I'm just going to pull the pattern towards me until it is parallel and it's the same width as the top of the pattern. The next step is we're going to get our pins. You don't need to place too many pins on the pattern piece, you just need to secure it down at certain points around the pattern. So we're going to grab our pins and then we're going to place them just along our pattern piece. Okay, let's just have a look at what that looks like at this stage. So you can see that our pattern piece is laid out flat on our fabric and that our grain line is running parallel to the edge of our selvage. You can also see that I've placed pins just in the corner close to the edge of the pattern piece. You're going to want to continue that around the pattern so that it's fully secure. Once we've finished pinning, we're going to use a sharp pair of fabric scissors to cut around our pattern, remembering to cut out the notches. When you're cutting out, it's important to use nice long strokes with your scissors to ensure the smoothest line of the fabric. You can hold on to the edge of your fabric to make sure that you're cutting in a straight line. At this point in time, you can see that we've cut out our fabric and we have 2 layers. Now, we want to make sure that we go around and cut out all of our notches. By making a small snip triangle shape. This is what the notch should look like. At this point, we've cut out both layers of fabric and we've cut out our notches so that we're clear on where they are. Once you've made sure that you've cut out both pieces of fabric and that you've cut out your notches, you can go ahead and unpin your pattern from your fabric. Make sure to pop your pins straight back into your pin holder so that you don't lose them. Taking off the pattern, we now have two pieces of fabric, and they will be the front shapes for our kimono. Once you've learned how to do this, you can go ahead and cut out the other pattern pieces you need. You'll need two pieces of front, one piece for the back, one piece for the trim around the neck, one piece for the trim around the bottom of the kimono, and a pocket if you choose to do one. On this pattern here, we have the back. You can see again that it has all of the information we need. It's a quick sew pattern, it's the back piece, and it asks here to cut one, but to place it on the fold. As you can see, this pattern piece has a grain line and an extra bit where it says centre back, place on fold. So we still need to make sure that our grain line, the grain of the fabric, is parallel to our selvage, but we also need to make sure that we're cutting this piece on the fold. This means that our fabric is folded in half, and when we open it up, we will have one continuous piece. Now for the back, you will continue to do the same that you did for the front by pinning down your pattern piece onto your fabric and cutting around the shape. Remember though, we're only going to be cutting along these lines here. We will not be cutting along the fold because we want that to stay intact so that we have one large piece. Remember again that you must cut out your notches.